I'm so delighted to have been invited to participate in this wonderful new work by SHELLY Jyoti. My name is Lisa Trivedi, and I'm a historian of modern India, teaching at Hamilton College in upstate New York. SHELLY asked me to think about Gandhiji and the global pandemic, and I've interpreted her invitation as asking two questions. How might Gandhiji's legacies help us to think clearly about the crisis through which we are living? And what actions might we take given Gandhiji's lessons? I have three thoughts to share with you today. The first is more of an observation. Our experience living through a global pandemic binds us to Gandhi in surprising ways we may not realize at first. As you are no doubt aware, Gandhi lived through the 1918-1920 global influenza pandemic. Influenza arrived in India in June of 1918, with Indian Army troops returning from Europe, where they were serving in the First World War. Some have suggested that a serious illness Gandhi suffered in August of 1918 may have been influenza, although this remains speculation. What we can say for certain is that the pandemic a century ago affected Gandhi and his family quite personally. One of his daughters-in-law and a grandchild succumbed to the disease. Without a vaccine or treatments, as we are developing today, influenza touched millions of lives across the globe, and it devastated India more than any other single country in the world. Gandhiji and his family were not alone in their loss. An estimated 12 to 18 million Indians succumbed to the disease, roughly 5% of the population of British India at that time. Our forefathers, in other words, faced and survived a human catastrophe of enormous proportion, one not dissimilar to what we are experiencing today. But despite his own loss and the loss of many, many around him, the era of the influenza pandemic was nonetheless a very busy one for Gandhi, who continued to engage with a range of political issues facing India at the same time. He supported mill workers who went on strike in Ahmedabad. Gandhi continued to write for his newspaper, Young India, where he publicly responded to the disappointing British government of India's Montagu-Chelmsford Report of 1918, to the passage of the controversial Rowlatt Acts, which restricted civil liberties in 1919, and to the atrocities of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which precipitated non-cooperation. From Gandhiji's life, in other words, we can learn that in the face of overwhelming suffering, personal loss, disorientation, all things we have experienced as a global community, despite those things, we must continue to face and address injustices when they occur. The second point I'd like to make is a comment on how Gandhiji might think about our pandemic a century later. Gandhiji had a complicated relationship with modern Western medicine. His political treatise, Hind Swaraj, includes criticism of doctors and the medicine that they practiced. He was critical of modern medicine because it treated the symptoms of the disease rather than their root causes. Gandhiji himself devoted significant time on a daily basis for decades, experimenting with his own health in order to find alternatives to modern physicians and their treatments. Faced with COVID-19, I suspect that Gandhi would embrace any action we could take to protect ourselves and our neighbors from the spread of the disease. But I'm also quite confident that he would have some very hard questions for each one of us. What is it that we are doing as a human civilization that has contributed to the rise or emergence of a disease like this? How might we live without placing the strain on nature, which produces deadly viruses like COVID-19? Gandhiji, in other words, would challenge us to think beyond immunization and treatment as a solution, and to examine deeply and then reform our lives in order to live in greater harmony with our environment rather than at its expense. The third point that I'd like to make is a sort of Gandhian prescription. Maybe that is something I shouldn't offer, but it's something for us to think about, possibly to put into action as individuals, as families, as neighborhoods or communities. One of the most powerful lessons that Gandhiji has left us is that change is within our power. Seemingly small individual actions in his teachings have proven to be transformative, not just for individuals or local communities, but in some cases for the entire world. This was the message of Satyagraha. Even in the darkest days of the pandemic, in the spring of 2020, and in the midst of the devastating Delta variant spike that followed this year, Gandhiji might encourage us to observe the actions of those who have done seva for their neighbors. He would want us to see and to meditate upon the goodness of righteous action. Of course, we have all read many stories of neighbors helping neighbors. I feel myself that I've read dozens and dozens of stories, uplifting, from India, from the United States over the past 21 months. But also, I've read these stories truly from nearly every country around the globe. That's power. And Gandhi would want us to observe that action, to recognize that power, and to undertake power and action ourselves. He believed that the performance of our dharma necessitated the undertaking of seva. Seva was what would bind humanity to one another. And he sought to share the particular lesson of seva drawn from India's rich traditions with the rest of the world. So I'd like to end my reflections with you with a beautiful example of Gandhiji's legacy in action today. I know it's just one of thousands and thousands of examples that can be seen across India as she has worked so tirelessly to address the pandemic for her population and beyond. I hope that it will inspire you to observe good action and to encourage those around you to do the same. This is the first step in reforming our own behavior and to performing seva for our neighbors. In rural Saurashtra, in Amreli district, Gujarat, is an institution founded upon Gandhian principles, the Sarvodaya Saraswati Mandir. It was started in the 1950s by workers who followed Gandhiji's instructions to go to India's villages and spread self-sufficiency among the most disadvantaged in the national community. Over the course of nearly 70 years, Sarvodaya Saraswati Mandir has educated thousands and thousands of children through the 15 schools established in that district, including elementary, intermediate, and secondary schools. The ashram is also home to a teacher's training college for women and to a balgar for children who have been abandoned or orphaned. When the second wave hit India, fear and stigma associated with COVID made it hard for villagers who were afflicted to seek treatment. With their own dormitories emptied during lockdown, the ashram's teachers made the extraordinary decision to open a COVID ward in their community. Now, let there be no mistake. The ashram community which had avoided any cases, was taking a risk. They were ready to accept COVID within their midst in order to serve others. And they recognized that their neighbors in the surrounding villages, who for the most part lived in one-room dwellings, had no way of isolating those who fell ill. They quickly created a ward for 28 patients. Local medical professionals were engaged to treat patients in need. Because the institution already ran a Seva Kendra, they had medicines and supplies on hand to care for patients. Sympathetic doctors and a local hospital provided what they could to the ashram to support the clinic. Patients were provided with food and liquids during their stay by the ashram, as well as Ayurvedic and homeopathic treatments. The ashram also assembled a small team of volunteers to help elderly couples and widows in the vicinity. This Gandhian institution in 2021 could not stop COVID from infecting its neighbors or from taking the lives of loved ones. But it did offer help, and it offered the comfort of neighborliness. It's an example I think Gandhiji would want us to focus upon today. He would want us to find inspiration to guide us as we continue to live with COVID and future diseases that are sure to follow. I want to thank SHELLY Jyoti again for this wonderful opportunity to contribute to an extraordinary event. I cannot wait to return to India myself in the year ahead, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you so much.